Well, welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 14 of Prince Caspian, How All Were Very Busy.
This was a very difficult one to write a summary for.
Why is that?
The first time I read it, I thought, okay, there's a battle. I don't know how I'm going to stretch that to 150 characters. 184 characters later. No, sorry, words. 180
Whoa,
words.
that's very short, Phil.
Very short. 184 words later, I realized that quite a bit happens within the battle, and then there's also the entire part where Aslan is picking people up, dropping people off.
Yeah, this is a really interesting chapter. So, I mean, listeners, we're at the penultimate episode before the end of the season for us. This is the second to last chapter in the book. We've only got one more to go, and there's a lot here in this chapter. I mean, I feel like you've really got two completely different stories that have a very interesting way in which they meet. I'm really excited to get into this.
They do. It's also hard to pick apart, well, not really pick apart, but it's hard to understand how the two timelines come together. It's hard to do a summary for that.
There's more nonlinear storytelling, which I really enjoy.
It's the Christopher Nolan chapter.
Well, before we get into your chapter summary, Phil, in the last episode, Peter had taken the high command of the Narnians and decided he was going to confront Miraz in single combat. But as that's going on, we learn of Glozell and Caspian, which I realized as I was editing the last episode, I spoke, this is not a shock to anyone, I was speaking very quickly, I was talking very fast, and it sounded like I was saying Sob, like with a B, like Sobi, Caspian.
Sobi, no fear.
Yeah. So, which I still don't even know if we're saying this correctly, but so we have Glozell and Caspian. They have a plan. We learned of their plan to themselves usurp the usurper, who is Miraz. So we'll see that come to fruition in this chapter. But that's where we left off in the last episode. So you want to take it away?
Let's take it away. As Truffle Hunter and Trumpkin are looking out over the battlefield, hundreds of thousands of awakened trees appear. But the dwarf points out that it won't be of any help unless the other side tries treachery. They turn their attention to the showdown between Peter and Miraz, and at first it looks like Peter will win easily. However, Miraz begins using his height and size to his advantage and fight back. A clever move takes Peter from near defeat to standing over a fallen Miraz. But while waiting for Miraz to get up, as a knight and a king does, Lords Glozell and Caspian send the Telmarines into battle and stab the king in the rush and confusion. With the awakened trees in play and the bridge removed from the escape route, the Telmarines quickly surrender, right as Aslan, with Susan and Lucy in tow, appear with Caspian's old nurse.
Very nice. I knew you were going to have to take one of those stories, whether it's Peter and Edmund and Caspian and the battle, or Susan, Lucy, and Aslan in Baruna. You're going to have to give one of those,
precedents.
Exactly, and it seems like you've done that with the battle. Was that your favorite? Like, which one of those two things do you enjoy more here in the chapters? Why did you give more of a focus to that? Just because of the words?
I feel like the battle was first in the chapter, and it had more pages. So it seemed like a bigger event.
Okay.
Subconsciously. That's probably why I started it out that way.
Yeah, interesting. I was just wondering. I think it's really cool that this chapter has a nonlinear approach to storytelling. My first takeaway, Phil, is that this is one of my favorite chapters of the whole book. I love it. I think we're ending pretty strong here. With Caspian, I think, we had that little dip in the middle of this book. I feel like we've had a couple of really good chapters in a row, but this chapter still suffers from some of my same frustrations that I've had throughout the whole book. Strong chapter, but I'll get to those in a minute. How did you feel about this chapter?
I really enjoyed this chapter quite a bit. Love a good battle. Love the way C.S. Lewis crafts a battle scene. He focuses on certain details. I was very tense while reading it the first time. Oddly enough, also the second time.
How about the third time?
I haven't read it a third time.
Wow, you are not prepared for this show, Phil.
You said 2 times.
I read both today.
Yeah. Well, I prepared last week, so.
So the chapter begins here with, it picks up right after chapter 13 ended. The single combat is about to begin. We get a exclamation from Trumpkin here. Crows and crockery. It's fine. Not my favorite.
I actually now rate these based on your system as I go.
Okay, what's my system?
I basically thought you'd say this one's okay.
Yeah, it's fine. It's. I'm glad it's there. Is there actually been? Is every chapter he's in? Does he have one of these?
I think he says it every chapter for sure.
I think it is.
Yeah.
You think Lewis had some like bet with somebody who's like, "Hey, could you put some of these cool? I'm trying to make these things happen."
I bet he had an intern write him. Say,
Oh, you
hey, give me 50 alliterative things.
But the exclamations you mean? They're not all alliterative though. That's the weird thing. Definitely the alliterative ones are the best ones. Though.
Maybe the intern ran out. I don't know.
So, Trumpkin has his exclamation there, and the battle really begins as soon as the Dryads and the Hamadryads and the Sylvans show up. So Aslan has, according to Truffle Hunter, waked them, and they are here.
They're now woke.
Yeah. They're there to watch the battle, but there's still some frustration from the Narnians because Aslan himself has not shown up. We have not seen or heard from Aslan since he roared and had the big party with Bacchus and Silenus, which is a couple of chapters ago at this point. So they're in this little arena that they're fighting in, and the way that Lewis describes the battle, did you realize this? Every time it is from the perspective of the spectators. It's never narrated like Peter does this or Miraz, swipes at his leg. He takes an arrow to the knee or anything like that. Instead, it's always the reaction of the Narnians to what is happening. How did you feel about that?
Here's what I love about it. That is how you experience most things.
Explain.
With the crowd. If you go to a baseball game, you're not necessarily
watching.
Yeah, you're watching, but you're watching with other people nearby,
okay.
Explaining what's happening, maybe telling you something you missed. It speeds it up. It feels like the action is taking place in real time. If you're in someone's head, it really slows the action down.
Mm-hmm.
And then I picked up my sword and lifted it back. It doesn't seem to go as quickly if it's in the moment, and then if they're telling it in the past tense, it's just not the same. But you usually watch things like this, and this feels like I'm watching it.
I really like your take on that because I was not a huge fan of this as I read this through both times that I read the chapter because I felt like it was just moving too fast. I mean, obviously I knew that Lewis is very purposeful in his writing, but I was just like, I want to know exactly what this fight is like. And I think some of it I've been reading recently. Have you ever heard The Wise Man's Fear? It's one of the Kingkiller Chronicles.
I don't know.
It's a fantasy book.
Okay.
It's just a fantasy book. There is a point where the protagonist in this book is learning this new kind of martial arts thing, and it goes very slowly, a page or so to describe the fighting. And so I think I've been so used to that because I've been reading. The book is like over 1,000 pages long, so I've just been spending a lot of time in that book recently. And I think when I got to this today, as I was reading it, I was like, oh my goodness, this is so fast. The battle seems like it's over quickly. But I think you're right that this is more realistic. I really enjoy that. You're changing my mind here.
Yeah, I just had a note that this is what a fight feels like.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not in it, and I feel like in this particular case, we're supposed to be a spectator.
And you've been on a lot of fights.
So many fights.
Yeah, Phil is really, really tough, y'all. Here's the thing I didn't like, though, Phil, about this section. There's a point where Caspian and Edmund grew white with sickening anxiety. And Edmund says something, and then Caspian says, hello, what's happening now? And I forgot that Caspian was even in the story.
And you also kind of forgot that he's 11, 13.
Yeah, he's a teenager. When that came up, I legitimately had forgotten he existed. Wow. And I think this is a problem because I think at this point he has gotten lost in his own story. Like it was very much, he played such a crucial role in this story until the Pevensies arrived. Or really just in those 4 chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, where we're getting it from his perspective. Really ever since then, it has still been very focused on the Pevensies. And I think in some ways that's okay because I don't think Prince Caspian, although he is the titular character, I don't think he's the protagonist. I think the Pevensies are still the protagonists of the story. So even though you've convinced me of that, Phil, there is a thing that I don't love here.
What's that?
When Caspian and Edmund, they grow white with sickening anxiety right here in the first page or so of the chapter. And Edmund has a little line about Peter's taking some dreadful knocks. And then Caspian says, hello. And I think he's exclaiming because what he's asking what's happening. And until that line, I had forgotten that Caspian was even in this story.
Wow.
And I know he had a little. Did he have anything to do in the last chapter? Because I don't think he did have anything to do, and he had just a little bit to do in sorcery and sudden vengeance. And it does, to me, it feels like he has gotten lost in his own story, which makes me ask the question of, is this Prince Caspian's story? That was a question I was confronted with reading this. He obviously is the titular character here, but is he the protagonist? And I thought the answer was yes.
I don't think so.
But I think I'm now agreeing with you. I think that's changed. I think the Pevensies are still our protagonists. Prince Caspian is an important character, but he's still part of the supporting cast here. He's not the main character.
So far from what I know about the 2 books we've read and my ideas about the future books, because I can't really remember, but I don't feel like the Lion, the Witch, or the Wardrobe were really the main points of the story.
Yeah, I mean...
the Pevensies were the main characters, and that's what they were encountering. And Prince Caspian's what they're encountering here.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean that he has to be the main character because the book is named after him. But I think in some ways it does feel like it's set up when he's introduced as, he's supposed to be the next king of Narnia. But the book isn't about him becoming the next king. It's about what the Pevensies do in their return to Narnia, which does set him up to become the next king. Spoiler alert. You've already read the last chapter, right?
I have at this point.
Okay, good. So I do still feel, though, that his character was really well developed in chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 when we kind of took when Trumpkin, was telling the story at the campfire to the Pevensies. I felt like I really got to know his character well, and then since then, I feel like we have spent so little time with him that I just don't know him as well as I want to.
Yeah.
We haven't really seen him much except for in that sorcery and sudden vengeance when they're fighting in the cave. He didn't really do anything in the last chapter. Then he doesn't really have much to do here at all. And so it does just feel like we spent so much time with him, and yet nothing really comes of all the time we spent with him.
Right.
That's how I feel right now. Maybe I'll feel differently as we end the book and even get into Dawn Treader, which he's a character in Dawn Treader. Maybe I'll feel differently there. But he does just feel... He's not a bad character. I like him, but he does feel underdeveloped.
I do feel like there's a big advantage there. That being, we want to know Prince Caspian more. That leaves us wanting more. There's another book coming. Again, C.S. Lewis is playing the long-term game, and I feel like we're well introduced to him, and there's a lot more to come. And this is already a pretty packed story. Having read the last chapter, I now understand how much he fit into this, and I feel like this was kind of to introduce Caspian and get him in place, and that's the role. If you added any more, I'm not sure where it would fit.
Yeah, that's fair. It's not something I'm asking C.S. Lewis to change. It's just something that and I think this is a good problem to have, that I'm wanting to spend more time with Caspian. I'd much rather be in this place where I desire more time with this character than be at a place where I'm just sick of him. So that's a good thing. So before this fight between Miraz and Peter ends, Miraz trips and falls down. And Peter, instead of attacking him, which I think we all would agree Miraz would do if their positions were swapped, Peter waits for him to rise. And this made me think, because it's a very a chivalrous thing to do, right? Mm-hmm. And it pointed me back to this idea that we've talked about throughout the whole season, that Michael Ward has posed in Planet Narnia and his book, The Narnia Code. This idea that Prince Caspian has so much imagery for the planet Mars, for the god of Mars, right? And I wanted to read a little bit from Michael Ward's book, The Narnia Code, because it relates to this, and I really like this. Peter, knight of the most noble order of the Lion, is the model of true knightly behavior. He is strong enough to defeat the treacherous Sobspian, but gentle enough to kiss the furry head of the badger. He has physical courage, risking his body in combat, but also takes care to remember seemingly unimportant traditions, such as the bear's hereditary right to be marshals, a term that is itself a martial pun. Peter shows true knightly self-control during his single combat with Miraz. When Miraz trips and falls, Peter refuses to attack him while he is down. This annoys Edmund, who is watching from the sidelines. Edmund says, "Oh, bother, bother, bother. Need he be as gentlemanly as all that? I suppose he must. Comes of being a knight and a high king." And then Dr. Ward goes on and says this. Lewis had fought as a soldier in the First World War, but he hated bloodthirstiness. War was sometimes regrettably necessary, he thought, but it should never become an excuse for mindless violence, conducted with a sort of macho, Rambo slash-and-burn attitude. No, the true warrior should be gentle as well as strong, disciplined as well as fierce. And I love that this is the Peter that we have here. Peter's been disappointing in some of his decisions in this book.
Yeah.
Right? Some of the ways that he is not
even
trusted.
recently.
Recently. But this is the height of Peter at his true kingliness. This is the high king in command. And I love this idea and the way that it also just relates to martial imagery. And so I thought that was a really cool thing. So I'm really thankful for Dr. Ward. And listeners, again, if you haven't picked up the Narnia Code or Planet Narnia, I would highly recommend it. It is such a fantastic read. So, Phil, what happens, though, because Miraz doesn't get up?
Miraz doesn't have a chance to get up because we have two treacherous people waiting for this moment, and they say, oh, he's been stabbed in the back, attack. And everybody does.
And they do, and they fight.
And on the way, one of them stabs the king in the back.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and read a paragraph from the text about that exchange. Peter hardly understood what was happening. He saw two big men running toward him with drawn swords. Then the third Telmarine had leaped over the ropes on his left. To arms, Narnia! Treachery! Peter shouted. If all three had set upon him at once, he would never have spoken again. But Glozell stopped to stab his own king dead where he lay. That's for your insult this morning, he whispered as the blade went home. Peter swung to face Sobspian, slashed his legs from under him, and with the back cut of the same stroke, walloped off his head. Edmund was now at his side, crying, Narnia! Narnia! The lion! The whole Telmarine army was rushing toward them, but now the giant was stamping forward, stooping low and swinging his club. The centaurs charged. Twang, twang behind, and hiss, hiss overhead came the archery of the dwarfs. Trumpkin was fighting at his left. Full battle was joined. A lot just happened.
So much.
Is this the most violence we've had in Narnia so far? A guy just got beheaded.
Yeah, someone literally lost their head.
It's a pretty big deal.
That's pretty violent.
This is so. In this, you have betrayal and a literal stabbing in the back, and then Peter going and just taking out Sobspian, just right then and there.
It's so fast too. There's not much build up to it.
And I think
clang, clang, loop.
And I think you're right about that's the way that Lewis writes his battles. They are quick. They're in real time. There is not a ton of attention given. And this goes to the point of why I read that piece from the Narnia Code. And what Dr. Ward is saying is that Lewis doesn't like violence for the sake of violence. He would believe that it was sometimes necessary, but it's not a showman. You're not doing it to show off. It's a necessary evil, if you will, to a end, to destroy evil, right? That's what's happening here. I feel like the way that he's writing his battles, we see that. It doesn't feel like, oh yeah, that was so cool that he chopped his head off. I get more of like, oh, that's so sad that this had to happen. You know what I mean? It's almost like a pity for the bad guys.
Yeah.
So the battle continues, and then C.S. Lewis writes this. Tough-looking warriors turned white, gazed in terror, not on the old Narnians, but on something behind them, and then flung down their weapons, shrieking, The wood! The wood! The end of the world! But soon neither their cries nor the sound of their weapons could be heard any more, for both were drowned in the ocean-like roar of the awakened trees as they plunged through the ranks of Peter's army, and then on in pursuit of the Telmarines. Have you ever stood at the edge of a great wood on a high ridge when a wild southwester broke over it in a full fury on an autumn evening? Imagine that sound, and then imagine that the wood, instead of being fixed to one place, was rushing at you, and was no longer trees but huge people. Yet still like trees because their long arms waved like branches, and their heads tossed and leaves fell around them in showers. It was like that for the Telmarines. It was a little alarming even for the Narnians. In a few minutes, all Miraz's followers were running down to the great river in the hope of crossing the bridge to the town of Baruna, and there defending themselves behind ramparts and closed gates. They reached the river, but there was no bridge. It had disappeared since yesterday. Then utter panic and horror fell upon them, and they all surrendered. That's a pretty crazy turn of events there, right?
It is.
Phil, as you were reading this for the first time, what hits you as you get to this point? And it's a 3-sentence paragraph there where at the beginning of it, yes, they're running away, but by the end of it, they've completely surrendered. The battle's over.
It communicates how every option was removed and how they realized just the severity of which they were defeated. So there's no chance. They had this big plan and then the bridge is gone. They weren't expecting that.
Yeah.
And even just another point on it, just listening to you read it now, I got lost in the story again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that speaks to how well written that scene is.
It's so good.
My mind is swimming with this image that I don't know if I could ever draw, but you just have all these trees moving so quickly, and it's this really exciting thing.
Well, I was drawn to the idea here of this being a eucatastrophe. Now, I'm sure many of our listeners are, but I don't know, are you familiar with the term eucatastrophe?
No.
So if listeners don't know, I think a lot will, because it kind of, if you're a fan of Narnia, you're probably also a fan of Tolkien. And so the word eucatastrophe was a term that was coined by Tolkien. He literally took the word catastrophe and then added the Greek prefix EU in front of it, which means good. And so a eucatastrophe is a good catastrophe in a way.
Huh.
I really want to dive into this idea. I want to take a little sidebar here and dive into this because I think it's really important, because this is such a pivot in the story. And I think if we don't understand this, I think a reader could read this and be like, wow, what a letdown, what a disappointing finale or conclusion or climax to the story, because we didn't get this giant battle scene like we thought we were going to get. We go from at the top of the page, it's, one page ago, Peter and Miraz are fighting, and the next page, everything is over. The entire victory has been won. I want to read from a letter that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote. This is letter 89 of his. It's written to his son, Christopher Tolkien, and he wrote it in November of 1944. I coined the word eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears, which I argued it is the highest function of fairy stories to produce. And I was there led to the view that it produces its peculiar effect because it is a sudden glimpse of truth, your whole nature chained in material cause and effect, the chain of death, feels a sudden relief as if a major limb out of joint had suddenly snapped back. It perceives, if the story has literary truth on the second plane, that this is indeed how things really do work in the great world for which our nature is made. And I concluded by saying that the resurrection was the greatest eucatastrophe possible in the greatest fairy story, and produces the essential emotion, Christian joy, which produces tears, because it is qualitatively so like sorrow, because it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one reconciled, as selfishness and altruism are lost in love. So we could do a whole episode on Tolkien's idea of Christ's resurrection being the ultimate eucatastrophe. We're going to kind of put that to the side, not because it's not important. It's of ultimate importance, but we just don't have time for that aspect here. So I want to hone in on this idea of eucatastrophe. Does it make any sense just hearing it like that?
It does, yeah.
He goes on in a later essay on fairy stories and writes this element of it as well. It is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of breath, a beat, a lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. So it's this sudden catastrophe for good. And that's what's happening here in the story, right? So I was thinking about this because the idea of a eucatastrophe can be maybe kind of controversial in a literary aspect, right, Phil? This idea of you've written this story and then all of a sudden you fix all the problems with the snap of a finger, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of times it's confused with the idea of a deus ex machina. Are you familiar with that term?
I am. So, God from the machine heavens.
Exactly. Yeah, God from the machine. So listeners, if you're not familiar with the term deus ex machina, it's a sudden resolution out of nowhere to what seems to be an unsolvable problem.
And the history is playwrights would write themselves into a corner, and
Yeah.
they couldn't get out, and then they would invent some character who would come down, and in the play they would literally come down from above, lowered down
On a machine.
with ropes, and they would solve all the problems and wrap everything up in a nice bow.
So I feel exactly, and I feel like a lot of times literary critics will be like a Deus Ex Machina is a bad thing, which I think to some extent it can be. I think it can be used well. That's not what we're making the point of. But I think there is a very different thing between a eucatastrophe here and a Deus Ex Machina. And I've heard it best said this way, that with a Deus Ex Machina, you exclaim as a reader, "Oh, wow, I can't believe that happened." But with a eucatastrophe, you exclaim, "Oh, of course that happened."
Yeah.
And so it's this idea that there's been foreshadowing. I mean, it makes sense. Of course Aslan has saved the day. Of course that bridge is in there. Of course the Narnians are going to reclaim their home. This makes sense. And that's why this isn't some crazy plot twist that it ends just so quickly. It's no, this is the only way this ever could have happened because Aslan is ultimately always in control.
And that's the biggest difference to me is we were prepared for it. We remember Lucy trying to wake the trees up earlier. Aslan actually woke them up a little bit later. It's not out of nowhere. We've been seeing pieces of this building up to it the whole time.
And what a good example this is for children that are reading this. It's not that our protagonists come and save the day themselves. Yes, they're catalysts to some of the saving that the Narnians need, but it's the trees. It's the Narnians who really save themselves here.
Yeah.
And I think this is great because it's not Peter and Edmund just walking in and Peter doesn't even defeat Miraz. His victory is just being brave enough to step up and say, "I'll fight you." But he, for all we know, maybe would have lost that battle. And so this is great storytelling. It is so unexpected. This is not what we think when we hear Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy returning to Narnia, because really the four of them do very, very little except Lucy trusts Aslan. And I love that victory. This is biblical. Victory belongs to Aslan. It doesn't belong to the kids.
Here's an interesting question for you. Just play along for a second.
Okay.
So let's say that the kids never showed up. Could Aslan have handled all of this by himself?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that Aslan could have handled everything himself, but what would have been missing from that story?
The Pevensies?
Yeah, and the changes that happen in the Pevensies.
That's true, yeah.
So I feel like we don't know why Aslan has to do it this way, but I do see one advantage being that the Pevensies have changed for the better. Peter was in this battle. Caspian learned something by example. Edmund is completely changed again somehow.
Yeah.
In a good way. He's a even better version of himself once again. And we also just see all four of them change. Lucy, not believing, but then believing, and then the others following suit. And then Edmund doing a complete 180 from who he was in the last book. So all this stuff happened. Aslan could have handled it himself, but for some reason he chose to
use them.
To use them this way. And I feel like that really matches up with what we're learning about God, where God doesn't need us to complete his plan, but for some reason we may not understand it. He wants us there. He wants us involved with it. And I do think that one advantage is that we grow and learn as we go through those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really well said. So I know that was kind of a long sidebar there. I hope listeners stuck with us. We will dive back now into the chapter, and I love that Lewis, so after all these Telmarines have surrendered, there's just the one sentence, "But what had happened to the bridge?" I love that Lewis asked the question for us, because you're like, wait, what did happen? We get another instance of some nonlinear storytelling here by Lewis. We go back in time to earlier that morning, and we find out that Aslan, Susan, and Lucy have been very busy. What have they been up to, Phil?
Rounding everybody up, driving the Aslan bus.
There's some
Let's go by this school. Let's go by this school. Pick up one person here, turn some people into pigs.
This is so much fun.
It is fun.
It is and we really haven't seen any human civilization here in Narnia yet. So it's interesting to be in a town and be hearing about them going to schools and stuff.
They're going to school. They're learning the wrong kind of history. I love how he describes the history. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
He says, the sort of history that was taught in Narnia under Miraz's rule was duller than the truest history you ever read and less true than the most exciting adventure story.
Oh, that sounds, as a history teacher, that sounds,
Well, I think that from what you've told me about what you're teaching, you're actually teaching some of the harder to teach stuff. I spent a lot of time after elementary school unlearning all the things that they left out all the bad details for.
All the bad details and stuff. Yeah. I mean, this is so fun. I mean, they meet a river god, and the illustration here again, Phil, you were really missing out.
Let me see. Oh, man. Got to get me one of those copies.
Yeah, so that's a really neat picture, and I love this exchange with Miss Prizzle.
Yeah.
And this is what Lewis writes as, he goes to Miss Prizzle, and she's just this really kind of mean teacher, and the class is mean. And this is a beautiful scene here because as she's giving marks to Gwendolyn for talking nonsense, Aslan roars, and Ivy comes into her classrooms, and this is what's left of her classroom. Miss Prizzle found she was standing on the grass in a forest glade. She clutched at her desk to steady herself and found that her desk was a rose bush. Wild people such as she had never seen were crowding round her. And if this isn't the restoration of the true religion after the corruption at work, I don't know what it is. I mean, this is exactly what Lewis is talking about in that letter that we talked about at the very beginning of this season. This is Narnia restored.
Yes.
And especially if you're a little kid reading this, you're like, yes, and they're getting rid of the schools and we're just going to be outside. This is great.
I've seen this in several different stories. There's always some kid who is trying to point out something amazing happening, and they're told to be quiet, and they're like, "No, but it's real." They're like, they're completely ignored. I feel like that must really resonate with a lot of people.
I'm sure it does. I mean, this is a great picture, and I know we haven't talked about the movie yet. This is one of the most disappointing things that none of this makes it into the film. I hate because this is so great, and I would love to see that. How fun is this?
I do think it's awesome. I hope there's a deleted scene that we don't know about.
Maybe there is.
But I also understand, as someone who had to write a summary for this, how this would be the part I would cut out.
But you want to cut out this part, Phil, where it says, at a well in a yard, they met a man who was beating a boy. The stick burst into a flower in the man's hand. He tried to drop it, but it stuck to his hand. His arm became a branch, his body the trunk of a tree, his foot took root. The boy who'd been crying a moment before burst out laughing and joined him. You want to take how do you not want that, though?
In terms of the overall story, I can see how that would be removed. I don't want to take it out. I want to film the whole thing. Do an extended version. Fair. That's another great illustration. Man. I also love that the kids that tattle on their teacher they are about to go tattle on their teacher, get turned into pigs. And it's the people who are going to squeal actually get turned into pigs. There's some really subtle little jokes going on here.
What does he say that Lewis says? So there's, they continue going on. They go to the school with all the boys in it who look like pigs. And Lewis says, and it was said afterward, whether truly or not, that those particular little boys were never seen again, but that there were a lot of very fine little pigs in that part of the country which had never been there before. And this is great. I love all of this. This is what we talked about a couple of chapters ago when Bacchus and Silenus returned, just the joy. I feel like we're just seeing this here too. There's the overflowing joy in this scene. And there are some Telmarines whose hearts are turned towards Aslan. I guess we can use that language maybe, that are able to join them. It's not like all the Telmarines are just rushed out and the Narnians take over. There are some Telmarines that get to stay. Like Gwendolyn, we hear about, I think it was the teacher herself of the boys' school that gets to stay. And so it's fun and enjoyable for all of this to be happening.
Definitely.
I do have one question, which is they somehow make it to Beaver's Dam from Baruna in the course of I don't know how many hours. And if I remember that Narnia map from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, those are across the Narnian countryside. So I'm still, we're back to season 1, Daniel, which is, I don't know where anything is.
They probably took the Aslan bus.
There you go. Well, I guess we just have to assume that he's very, very fast.
So speaking of maps.
Okay.
Do you know how Pauline Baynes came to illustrate this book?
With writing utensils. No, that's like a Phil joke. Sorry, I'm not as good at this as you are.
Why does everyone say that? No, so Pauline Baynes sent an unsolicited artwork to a publisher, Tolkien walks into that publisher and is looking around, and he sees that there is indeed some great art. He goes, wow, this is really good. Ends up getting her to illustrate one of the stories that he was writing at the time. And he was really happy with it. She also drew a map of Middle Earth.
Yeah, have you ever seen it?
Did all this great stuff. I think you have it on a blanket over here, don't you?
Well, no, I have a map of Middle Earth in my house that's a blanket, but not the one that Baines did. It's kind of like the standard one.
It's a different
I'll
one.
have to put it in the show notes for listeners.
Yeah.
Her map of Middle Earth is really beautiful.
But I didn't realize that Tolkien was the one who ended up getting Pauline Baines basically the work that she had. And then that same publisher was doing C.S. Lewis's stuff. Lewis was really nice to her in person, but she was really hurt later when he said that she cannot draw lions. And that's just...
I've heard about that. They had kind of like a falling out because he didn't like...
and that wasn't a very nice... But he said it to his biographer, not to her.
Yeah.
And just... that's tough.
So yeah, Baines's work is incredible. I think we'll keep talking about her throughout the entire series that we're doing here. It's so great. But the last thing that happens in this chapter is that Aslan goes to the home of a sickly woman. And what's going on there, Phil?
So Aslan sees a little girl crying, asks her why. The girl says that Ani is very ill. They go up to the aunt. Aslan enlists Bacchus to get some water from the well. It turns out to be some really nice wine. She drinks it, starts to feel a lot better.
And this feels like a mashup of a lot of different like gospel stories, doesn't it? Where it's like Jesus going to someone
water
who's
into
sick,
wine,
water into wine, a lot of other things. Is Bacchus actually turning the water into wine, or did he just get some wine? I think you're right. I think he did go to the well.
But who turned it into wine?
That's fair.
Was it wine before he got it? We don't know. But it all seems a little random until the very last line of the chapter. You want to read that?
You got it.
And the first thing that happened was that the old woman slipped off Aslan's back and ran across to Caspian, and they embraced one another, for she was his old nurse.
Yes, that's a nice little bit of closure there.
Goosebumps.
Oh, you like
every
that?
time.
You like it. I think my favorite part is when she first gets the wine and she says, "Oh, you've done something to our well. That makes a nice change, that does." And she jumped out of bed. I love just that exchange there. So that's where the chapter ends, where Aslan and his company have kind of made it back to Peter and his army, and all of our protagonists are together, and the story is seemingly wrapped up with a nice little bow.
Right.
But we got a chapter left.
One more chapter.
What do you think is going to happen in the next chapter, Phil?
Well, I've actually read ahead this time.
Oh.
By one chapter.
So what did you think was going to happen before you read that other chapter?
I figured everyone needed to get home somehow.
Okay.
Because then they have to come back. Some of them. Yeah, so that about wraps up my thoughts as well, too. But before we go, Phil, I think you have an email for us you're going to read. I do. This one is from Josh. He says, "Thanks for the great podcast. I enjoy listening to every new episode. And I just finished listening to Chapter 12, Sorcery and Sudden Vengeance."
Sorcery and Sudden Vengeance.
That's what we should be doing. This was a really unique chapter, and there was plenty to discuss, so I thought I'd share a few thoughts. First, y'all discussed the character of Knickerbrick and why he acted the way he did, and why he ultimately chose to turn to evil. It's very interesting the way Lewis decided to put Knickerbrick, Truffle Hunter, and Trumpkin, three vastly different characters, all together. Truffle Hunter was loyal to Aslan the whole time, and even though he had probably never seen him, he continued to have faith in him, and he knew that Aslan would take care of them. Trumpkin is not a mean dwarf, but you can tell that he relies on his own wits and skills to deliver him. He doesn't believe in things that he can't see, so he simply does what is best according to what he knows. Knickerbrick is the most complicated character, and I definitely think that Knickerbrick wasn't always angry the way he is presented in Prince Caspian. After he is killed, the point is made that he had gone bad on the inside from years of suffering. I think even though we don't know, it is entirely possible that he was a good dwarf, but someone close to him was killed or afflicted by the Telmarines, which caused him to be bitter for the rest of his life, and be willing to do anything to punish and abolish the Telmarines. All three of these characters represent people in the world and their relationship towards God. Truffle Hunter represents a Christian who is faithful to God and believes in him even when he doesn't know what will happen. Trumpkin represents someone who believes in himself and eventually must come to the point of realizing that he can't do everything through his own power. Finally, Knickerbrick represents what happens when people go through hard times. They either turn to God or they become bitter and reject him. It is incredible the way Lewis put all these characters together and the lessons he teaches while continuing to have a great story. Once again, thanks for the great podcast, and I look forward to the next episode.
That is some great analysis by Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And that was very well written. We really appreciate how you laid all that out. And I agree.
What I really liked about Josh's take is his idea about Nickabrick, and he kind of fills in the gaps. We've talked about this before. We've talked already a lot about Tolkien in this episode. We've often made the comparison that Tolkien really fleshes out and fills in his world, and C.S. Lewis lets his readers do that. And that's what Josh is doing here with Nickabrick. He's talking about, maybe something happened or someone close to him was killed or afflicted by the Telmarines. And I love that Lewis gives us license to fill in these stories ourselves. And I love that Josh has done that. He's given me some ideas of what I can now think about. The next time I read this through, I'll be thinking about maybe this is kind of the backstory I'm taking with Nickabrick as I'm reading. So, Josh, thank you for that. That's going to improve my reading of Caspian the next time I go through.
Definitely.
So, Phil, why don't we just do one more? We got time for one more.
All right, go for it.
Well, we also have an email from Nicole, and she wrote this. In answer to your question, I've always loved Prince Caspian. I love the idea of an outsider like him who should want to conquer Narnian culture, but actually wants to heal it. It feels very redemptive. Honestly, my least favorite is probably the Dawn Treader, because neither the Missing Lords nor Caspian play a big role in the following books. It just feels like a long, and then she put in all caps, long attempt to make us like Eustace, who is awful. No spoilers. My favorite is, and has always been, The Magician's Nephew, because it makes so much sense out of the other books. I hate that it and The Last Battle have never been made into movies because it feels like chopping Genesis and Revelation off the Bible. And somehow people always forget that the horse and his boy exists. Which is true, because I feel like you and I talked the least amount about the horse and his boy because we were both not familiar with it very much.
Right. And I will say, after doing this for almost 2 complete seasons, I'm really excited about those other books.
Yeah.
I have no idea what happens in them.
So with Nicole's thought here about not liking the Dawn Treader because she just feels like that, Caspian and some of the other characters don't play a big role in any of the following books. Do you have any trepidation going into this? Or, what are your thoughts as we get ready for season 3?
Here's my fear. I feel like there's a reason that they made movies about the first 3.
Oh, okay.
And that they keep trying to make stuff out of them, but they never get to the other books.
Interesting.
Why is that?
Money.
Might be money.
But that's great. So I love Nicole shouting out her love for Prince Caspian. I love, we started this season saying, not that many people really like Prince Caspian. We've had quite a few Caspian lovers emailing us and telling us how much they like this book.
And again, you said that. I didn't have an opinion.
That's
and
true.
now I actually really like it. So.
That's fair. That's very, very fair. So listeners, again, thank you so much for reaching out to us. We really appreciate that. So Phil, why don't you go ahead and wrap us up here?
Okay, you can follow us into Narnia on our Twitter and Facebook pages. If you have any feedback, feel free to email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail. Definitely leave us a voicemail. We love voicemails. 406-646-6733 is the number. We'd also appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts. This helps other listeners find the show and join our read-through. Also, make sure you subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app so you can wake up to a new episode every other Wednesday. Our show's themes were created by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more of his work in the links in the episode's description. Thanks for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time with the conclusion of Prince Caspian.